Good morning, folks. The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will come to order. Our subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on responding to the Global Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing is limited to the chairman, the ranking member, the vice chair, and the vice-ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses and keeps members on schedule. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Seeing no objection, it is so ordered. Well, good morning and welcome to our panelists. Thank you for joining us to examine the Extinction Crisis. We are honored to have such a distinguished panel with us here on the 22nd International Day for Biological Diversity. Earlier this month, a team of scientists from around the world released a comprehensive report detailing just how many species are at risk of extinction because of human activity. The numbers are staggering. As many as 1 million species are threatened with extinction. That's 1 in every 8 species around the world. This isn't the first hearing where we're talking about the extinction crisis. Scientists have been ringing the alarm bell for years. We're currently in what they call the 6th mass extinction, and species are disappearing 100 times faster than historic rates, mostly because of things that we are doing. We need to acknowledge that, because the loss of all these species is not only hurting natural systems, it threatens the lives and livelihoods of people around the world. The report highlights the loss of biodiversity and how it's experienced differently by different social groups, countries, and regions. It's likely that people who will be hit hardest by this biodiversity loss will be some of the world's most vulnerable populations, despite the fact that the benefits and burdens of resource use that drives biodiversity loss are unequally distributed. So as we discuss this crisis, let's keep in mind that this is also about the very real impacts these losses will have on people around the world. Coastal protection, thriving fisheries, clean water, clean air, and other ecosystem services and economic benefits are at risk. So are the values, traditions, and land management strategies of indigenous communities. The report identifies the top 5 causes of this rapid species loss: land and sea use changes, exploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. All of these are things we can do something about. But we're not yet on track to slow the extinction crisis. We need to do more. As I said at our State of Wildlife hearing in March, this committee is working on many innovative ideas and bills to address threats and recover species both domestically and around the world. And despite the overwhelming evidence that we have an extinction crisis on our hands, the Trump administration is going in the opposite direction to appease special interests and big donors. The Endangered Species Act continues to be a top target of this administration. It is our strongest tool in the conservation toolbox for recovering threatened endangered species, and we need a strong, durable ESA now more than ever. But the administration is currently finalizing rules that would create loopholes in the ESA, putting more species at risk of extinction and giving more leeway to industry. Weakening the ESA is the worst thing we could do at the worst possible time. The administration is also slow-walking species listing. Only 17 species have been listed since 2017, far below the rate of listing under former administrations, including the Reagan administration, which was no fan of species listings. And now the Trump administration is trying to change the ESA so they can ignore climate change impacts to endangered and threatened species. In its drive for energy dominance, this administration is putting more plant and animal species at risk in order to expand oil and gas activities, including in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The refuge is home to over 700 species, including polar bears, wolves, and the porcupine caribou herd, which the Gwich'in people have relied on since time immemorial. But the Trump administration, along with their allies in Congress, are working to open it up to oil and gas development. And the administration's also proposed to open new offshore areas for oil and gas activities threatening ocean ecosystems and the existence of imperiled species like the North Atlantic right whale. Finally, the administration's short-sighted plan to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement will set back global action on climate change, further exacerbating the extinction crisis. The House of Representatives recently passed H.R. 9, a bill to keep the United States in the agreement it is time for the Senate to act. We need to think about what we can do to slow the loss of biodiversity, because maintaining the status quo is certainly not good enough. We need to be willing to take a hard look at our role in the large-scale drivers of this crisis, especially climate change, and we need to take action. Let's roll up our sleeves and do the difficult but necessary work to protect and conserve our ecosystems and wildlife, because as the Biodiversity Report points out, the loss of species has a profound and irreversible effect on people. And with that, I invite the ranking member to say a few remarks, and then we'll welcome and introduce our witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 1970, S. Dillon Ripley of the Smithsonian Institution predicted that by 1995, between 75 and 80% of all species of living animals on our planet would be extinct. In 1979, Oxford University biologist Norman Myers predicted that 1 million species would go extinct by the year 2000. In 1989, Noel Brown, a senior UN environmental official, warned that by the year 2000, entire nations would be wiped off the face of the earth as oceans would rise up to 3 feet. Well, now along comes the latest contribution to apocalyptic predictions, the United Nations Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It has issued a report that predicts, quote, nearly 1 million species are now threatened with extinction. The subcommittee meets today to consider this report, except they haven't issued a report. They've issued a summary of a report written by climate activists for climate activists, but the 1,500 pages of science remains classified, so there's no way presently to evaluate it. That's the antithesis of science, which is based on transparency and independent verification. But we do know this. According to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, science has actually cataloged a little under 1.8 million species. Of those, just 800 species are known to have gone extinct in the last 500 years. Of the extinctions we've actually documented, roughly 75% occurred on islands and 86% were the result of introduced non-native species. So what are we to do? Well, any true scientist would tell us first to review the science. Wait for the report to be released and then expose it to rigorous scientific review before making policy. Instead, the report, or should I say the summary of the report for policymakers, prescribes transformative change. Now, if you're wondering what that means, they're very clear. Quote, by transformative change, we mean a fundamental system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors, including paradigms, goals, and values, unquote. Now, in practical terms, that means reducing human population growth, forbidding overconsumption, and, quote, addressing inequalities, especially regarding income and gender, which undermine capacity for sustainability. It also calls for, quote, the evolution of global financial and economic systems to build a global sustainable economy, steering away from the current limited paradigm of economic growth, end quote. Now, skeptics might be inclined to think the subcommittee has bitten off a little more than it can chew today. But do not despair. As Ronald Bailey, the science correspondent for Reason magazine, writes, many of the transformative changes advocated by the IPBES are already happening as a result of the economic growth that the UN agency wants to steer us away from. Due to increasing wealth, education, and urbanization, world population will peak later this century around 8 to 9 billion. He goes on to point out that growing prosperity and technology is resulting in increasingly more efficient resource use and growing income and gender equality. Turns out that freedom works. There have been periods within both recorded history and throughout paleo history when scientists tell us temperatures were much higher and also much colder than they are today. Science tells us that carbon dioxide levels have varied widely throughout the planet's history, including periods when they were many times higher than they are today. Science tells us that at the peak of the last ice age, ocean levels were 400 feet lower than they are today. Hurricane activity is much lower than recorded in the 18th century. And despite what we're told, there's a vigorous debate within the scientific community over how human activity compares with vastly more powerful natural influencers that have driven climate change for 4.5 billion years. As Chicken Little belatedly discovered, There's a big difference between an acorn and the sky. History, and especially recent history, is filled with apocalyptic predictions about the end of the world, and we're still waiting. The irony is that we look back and laugh at each generation that succumbs to these fits of hysteria. We chuckle at the reflection of our own human nature in the tale of Chicken Little or the Emperor's New Clothes. I just wonder how future generations will view us. I yield back. Oh, and I also would ask unanimous consent that Mr. Gosar be permitted to sit on the committee today.
Without objection. And I don't know that I need to ask unanimous consent for the chair of the Natural Resources Committee to sit on the dais, but I hope that would be granted if needed. Very good. We will now introduce our witnesses. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Eduardo Brondizio, co-chair of the Global Assessment Report. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Yoon Shin, senior scientist working in IRD, a French public research institute and an author of the IPBES Global Assessment. Next, we'll hear testimony from Dr. Patrick Moore, director of the CO2 Coalition. Next will be Dr. Mark Morano, co-founder of Climate Depot. And then we will hear testimony from Sir Robert Watson, the immediate past chair of the IPBES. And finally, our last witness will be Dr. Jacob Malcolm, the director of the Center for Conservation Innovation at Defenders of Wildlife. Welcome, everyone. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they should limit their oral statements to 5 minutes. The entire written statement will, of course, appear in the hearing record. When you begin your testimony, you will see a green light, which when there is 1 minute left will turn yellow, and then, of course, when it turns red, it's time to wrap up and complete your testimony. I will ask the entire panel to testify before bringing it back to the members for our questions. So with that, let me recognize Dr. Brondizio to get us started. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee members, for the invitation. And thank you for providing a great summary of the assessment, in fact. It's an honor to be here on behalf of hundreds of authors who have contributed to this report. Independent, voluntary work. They have done the most comprehensive review and analysis of the scientific evidence and data sets related to the topic. And we went through 2 full open review processes during this period, where all the chapters of the assessment made available for whoever wants to review. We received about 15,000 comments to which we addressed and responded each one. And we delivered to the plenary not only the summary for policymakers, but all the chapters of the assessment to all the delegations that participated in that plenary. Very briefly, as a summary of the report, 5 key points. So as you said, first, what we documented is that we have significantly impacted the biosphere and the atmosphere over the past 50 years. Around 75% of terrestrial environments, 66% of ocean, 85% of wetlands have been significantly altered. We see the converging pressures of land use, resource exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species to a level not seen before. So some of the evaluations that we did, we evaluated 18 categories of ecosystem service or nature's contributions to people. Of the 18 categories evaluated with all the literature available on the topic, 14 show decline. Most of those declines are in the what's called regulating categories of ecosystem functions and non-material categories, which both have direct implication for people's quality of life. We also evaluated with all the data and indicators possible all the IT targets. And we found that out of the 20 IT targets, we have made progress to 4 of the IT targets. Now, we have documented numerous cases of progress and advances that are both at the national and local level, but also at the global level. We have increased our protection of protected areas and implemented many positive changes in agriculture, fisheries, and forest. There are many good cases and initiatives to talk. So it shows that we can and have adopted conservation and sustainable use measures with some success, but not enough to counter the pressures that we put on the planet. So we have not addressed the drivers of change. We look at all the indicators for that. 9 of 13 indicators show decline. So overall, when we look at all the Aichi targets, 12 of 16 indicators about nature conditions have deteriorated during this period. The scenarios point to an equal concerning situation. And along with climate change and increasing pressure from land use, invasive species, pollution, and other drivers, is expected to intensify the impact in terms of shifts of species distribution, changes in phenology, changes in composition, and significant shrink of habitats for a significant number of species. So, indeed, the threats that we see now are unprecedented on both levels, but perhaps most, and even of greater concern, are the threats to our development goals. When you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, our analysis shows that 80% of the Sustainable Development Goals are compromised by trends that we see now in nature and biodiversity. So, as you said, and it was noted, we have reacted and we have developed solutions in many ways. The global assessment points to different pathways that are very concrete that can be applied at different contexts to overcome these problems. It shows very clearly that climate change, nature deterioration, and achieving a good life for all needs to be done synergistically and together. So we point to pathways to reconcile food production and conservation, to expand protected areas and align protected areas with conservation outside protected areas, to manage and conserve fisheries and marine ecosystems through integrated management involving land, freshwater, and oceans. We look at several cross-sectoral and sector-specific solutions to water problems, particularly in the context of climate change, rising demand for extraction, and increased levels of pollution for fresh water. We talk and analyze land-based climate change mitigation and show the problem with large mega-scale and the potential problems with large mega-scale liquidation. And we talk about integrated city-specific and landscape-level planning to find solutions for integrating landscapes with the broader area. So many solutions are pointed to and available in the assessment so we can move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. The chair now recognizes Dr. Shen for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I have the great honor to present some key findings on marine biodiversity based on the IPBES global assessment. So let me start by a broad brush picture of where we are today. The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Marine biodiversity has been impacted at unprecedented rates by human activities. Globally, fishing exploitation has had the largest impact. In response to increased demand for seafood, fishing effort has continued to increase, but global catches have stagnated for over 20 years. This is a clear sign of global overfishing. 93% of fish stocks are now classified as overfished or fully fished, with severe impacts on non-target species and habitats. Along the coast, sea use changes bring challenges in addition to climate change. Over 2.6 billion people live on or near the coast, where demand for multiple benefits intensifies. The most productive coastal ecosystem henceforth threatened: seagrass meadows, mangroves, and of course coral reefs. Pollution is a major driver of negative impact as well. Plastic pollution, for example, has increased tenfold since 1980, affecting the vast majority of marine turtles, mammals, and seabirds. Excessive use of fertilizers cause eutrophication in coastal waters and subsequent development of anoxic dead zones, covering a total area equivalent to that of the United Kingdom. The dramatic loss of biodiversity imperils human societies as oceans provide major ecosystem services. Just a few examples. Phytoplankton produce about half the global oxygen. The ocean supports fisheries and aquaculture production, providing direct employment for 60 million people. Coastal ecosystems protect shorelines from storms and sea level rise. The ocean is also central to regulating the Earth's climate as it sequesters 25% of the anthropogenic emissions of CO2. Globally, none of the current threats will decrease in the future under business-as-usual scenarios. Our models show that our future oceans will strongly depend on the amount of greenhouse gases emitted today and in the coming decades. Under business as usual, fish biomass is projected to decrease by 23% and to move poleward, leading to local extinctions in the tropics. Coral reefs are projected to decline to 1% at 2 degrees warming. Along coastlines, the upsurge in extreme climatic events and sea level rise will cause further loss of habitats. Models also project a dramatic expansion of hypoxic regions and enhanced acidification, altering the survival of organisms. Future climate change will act in synergy with other drivers, fisheries exploitation, for example. Under business-as-usual management, the proportion of overfished stocks would increase by 20% in 2050, while fisheries benefits would drop. On the contrary, under rights-based management, annual profit would exceed that of business as usual by about $50 billion. Such fisheries reform, combined with adaptation measures to climate-induced changes, could even offset the negative impacts of climate change, except in the highest emission scenario. So what can we do globally? The eBest Global Assessment shows that options exist that can make a difference with 4 key leverage points. First obvious leverage point is to achieve sustainable exploitation. Today, only 7% of fish stocks are underfished, offering little scope for expanding fisheries, especially since they are often of low commercial and nutritional value. The only option to sustain the increasing demand for fish is to rebuild depleted stocks. And it's urgent to act today because rebuilding takes time, usually 2 to 3 times species lifespan. It's also urgent in this regard to take actions to eliminate illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Secondly, harmful subsidies must be halted as they're associated with overfishing and inefficient production. Vested interests may oppose that, but policy reforms offer the potential to both preserve nature and provide economic benefits. Thirdly, scenarios project strong benefits for both biodiversity and fisheries from expanding and better connecting the current network of marine protected areas, including new locations in underrepresented regions or new locations to adapt to climate change. Today, MPS cover 7.6% of the ocean, but no-tech marine reserves only cover 2.2% of the ocean. Finally, the IPBES report shows the importance of addressing inequalities. Developed countries have often contained fishing impacts in their national waters by importing seafood, mainly from developing countries, or by translocating their fishing pressure in foreign waters, mainly in developing countries. As a result, almost 3/4 of global catch is produced in developing countries, so those countries suffer the highest biodiversity degradation. For local communities, reduced and unequal access to marine resources may be a source of conflict. Equitable share of fish resources is a ubiquitous challenge worldwide, not only in developing countries. Small-scale artisanal fisheries account for over 90% of the employment and nearly half of the global fish catch. The rest of fish production is concentrated within a few countries and a few corporations, while funds channeled through tax havens support most industrial vessels implicated in illegal, and unregulated fishing. It's therefore critical to spur well-managed small-scale fisheries that use selective and non-destructive gears in order to promote employment, lower fossil fuel consumptions, and reduce fisheries' footprint on the oceans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Dr. Moore for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was not until the early 1900s, marked by the extinction of the passenger pigeon in 1914, that the general public began to take a keen interest in the subject of species extinction. This awakening was inspired by the early activism of Theodore Roosevelt, John Muir, and Gifford Pinchot. Next slide after that. Thus, our species, Homo sapiens, became the first and only species to be concerned about the survival of all species on Earth. To the best of our knowledge, the only home for life in the universe. As a result of this now international concern, institutions have been created to identify endangered species and to develop programs to prevent their extinction. In the past century, there has been a marked decline in the number of extinctions as these programs have been implemented. Fewer than 900 extinctions have been documented in the 500 years since 1500 AD. About 95% of them were on islands. In February 1999, National Geographic published a chart showing the 5 major extinction events during the past 600 million years. It clearly shows that the number of taxonomic families of life have steadily increased over this time. They warned of a 6th mass extinction driven by humanity. Number 6 on the graph notes that beetles, amphibians, birds, and large mammals are the hardest hit. I asked the editors, why does the line turn fuzzy at the end? I knew that no taxonomic families have gone extinct in modern times. They replied, but did not explain the fuzziness. The downturn at the end of the graph is purely bogus. There is good paleontology for the 5 major extinctions, during which 50 to 90% of all existing species became extinct. There is zero evidence that any such event is occurring now or has even begun to occur. There are three primary causes of species extinction by humans. 1, overhunting for food and purposeful eradication of pests. 2, massive clearing of native ecosystems for food and fiber production. Vast fields of corn are grown for biofuel due to green priorities. Equally vast expanses of land have been converted, next slide, and then the next slide, to palm oil plantations for biodiesel. Next slide. The same is true of massive solar farms, next slide, covering land that could be rich in native species. These policies must be reconsidered. 3, the introduction of exotic predators such as rats, cats, foxes, and snakes, especially on islands where this has been the greatest cause of extinction in recent years. The IPBES claims that there are 8 million species, yet only 1.8 million species have been identified and named. Thus, the IPBES believes there are 6.2 million unidentified and unnamed species. Therefore, 1 million of the unknown species could go extinct overnight, and we would not notice it because we would not have known they existed. This is highly unprofessional, stated politely. Scientists should not, in fact, cannot, predict estimates of endangered species or species extinction based on millions of unnamed species. This is not a new phenomenon. The so-called sixth great extinction has predicted for decades. It has not come to pass, similar to virtually every doomsday prediction made in human history. The IUCN is the only international observer organization in the UN General Assembly specifically concerned with biodiversity and nature protection. My organization, the CO2 Coalition, finds the IUCN findings on biodiversity and endangered species to be far more credible than those of the IBPPS, which are not credible in the slightest. It is quite clear that the highly exaggerated claims of the IPBES are not so much out of concern for endangered species as they are for affront for radical political, social, and economic transformation of our entire civilization. Their recommendation for an end to economic growth alone condemns the developing world to increased poverty and suffering. Appealing to the green urban class, the IPBES recommends urban agriculture and rooftop gardens as part of their transformational agenda. No mention is made of eliminating millions, hundreds of millions of acres of former native ecosystems converted to biofuel plantations and solar farms. As with the manufactured climate crisis, they are using the specter of mass extinction as a fear tactic to scare the public into compliance. The IPBES itself is an existential threat to sensible policy on biodiversity conservation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this subject.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Morano for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank the House Resources Committee for this opportunity. My background is in political science, which happens to be an ideal background for examining yet another United Nations environmental report. And in my written submission, I have all the scientists, within minutes, hours of this report being released, scientists from around the world started questioning the numbers and the extrapolations and the estimates from the United Nations, pointing out that since 1870, species extinctions have actually been in decline. And these are basically computer models of species we don't even know exist, how they're extrapolating that. But beyond that, the key I want to focus on in my testimony here is as an investigative journalist studying the United Nations, and I've been to nearly every UN environmental climate conference in the last 2 decades, including the Earth Summit in Johannesburg and the Earth Summit in Rio in 2012, I have been a student of the United Nations. And in my book, I actually feature the politically incorrect guide to climate change, the poster child of endangered species, the polar bear surfing on a wave. And we'll get to what happened to the polar bear in a minute as the icon of the global warming movement. But in terms of this latest United Nations report, it is a very thinly veiled attempt to hype, distort biodiversity concerns, which there are many legitimate ones, but not as presented by the United Nations. It's the latest UN appeal to give it more money, more power, more scientific authority, more money, and more regulatory control of the economy and people's lives. The UN Species Report requires, quote, a huge transformation is needed across the economy to protect and restore nature. What kind of a huge transformation are we talking about? Well, the UN in its press release invoked authoritative science, and that is, of course, produced by the United Nations. The UN Executive Secretary declared it presents authoritative science to decision makers for their consideration. At best, the US science represents nothing more than authoritative bureaucracy. A more accurate term would be authoritative propaganda. And the reason I say that is we have the head, this is modeled after the climate panel, the IPCC. The former chair, Robert Watson, is here. Another former chair of Agenda Pachari declared global warming was his religion. This was the chair of the alleged science panel of the United Nations on climate. Another top UN IPCC official explained that we will redistribute the world's wealth by climate policy. You have to free oneself of the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. It almost has nothing to do with environmental policy anymore. That was Otto Edenhofer, a UN official, telling you that this is essentially the UN, a self-interested organization lobbying for political change. We have the former UN chief Christiana Figueres, who I've interviewed for the book, talking about we seek a centralized transformation that will make life on planet Earth very different, using hyped environmental scares. I go back to the 1960s and showed that from overpopulation, deforestation, global cooling, resource scarcity, no matter the environmental scare, the solution was always the same: wealth redistribution, central planning, and sovereignty limiting treaties. So what I'm here today is to tell you, I'm not here to give some vague critique of the United Nations. I'm here to tell you that the three lead authors here, or the three top officials from the UN, are part of this con that the United Nations presents itself as the world's expert on scientists, the world's leading authorities. The standards by which these summary for policymakers are issued, they actually have line by line, has to be agreed on by UN bureaucrats, politicians, and then the underlying report, which hasn't been released yet on the species, has to be made in line with what was agreed to by the political class. This is not a scientific process, and in fact, in my testimony, I show how it violates the Department of Energy's own standards for US science to be taken seriously on this, to be violating our own scientific standards. One point on the polar bears, Al Gore mentioned them and featured them as an icon in his first movie. His sequel in 2017 didn't mention polar bears once. They are at or near historic population highs. So I'm not talking about the UN vaguely. I'm talking about Sir Robert Watson here, Edward Brandizio, Dr. Shin. They are the leaders of this UN politicization of species endangerment science. They are fully engaged in using what they claim to be authoritative science to lobby for more power and expanding control of the United Nations. Dr. Watson actually says the future of humanity depends on action now. Dr. Watson, sitting next to me, or Sir Robert Watson, is claiming the United Nations can identify the problem, put itself in charge of the solution. He says it's our last chance to save the planet. These are the words of a salesman, a science bureaucrat, not a disinterested...
I'd like to ask the witness to direct your testimony to the chair
Sure.
and not to your fellow
Dr. Watson, though, these are the words of not a scientist, but of a science bureaucrat doing the bidding for his organization, just as he did during the ClimateGate scandal. They trotted him out on all the TVs.
Thank you, Mr. Morano.
To say nothing to be seen here.
The chair now recognizes Sir Robert Watson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First, let me comment that IPBES is not a UN body. It is a truly independent intergovernmental body. It analysed 15,000 pieces of work, and we received 15,000 comments from experts all over the world. So it's a heavily peer-reviewed document. The evidence is unequivocal. Biodiversity, which is important in its own right and essential for human well-being, is being destroyed by human activities at a rate unprecedented in human history. Biodiversity, which plays a critical role in providing food, fiber, water, energy, medicines, and other genetic materials, is also important in regulating climate, water quality, pollution, pollination services, flood control, and storm surges. It also has important social dimensions, including physical and mental well-being. Since 1970, trends in agricultural production, bioenergy production, and harvest of materials has increased, but most of the regulating contributions and social dimensions have declined. Human activities have continued to destroy forests, grasslands, wetlands, and other important ecosystems, As you already heard, 75% of the ice-free land surface has already been significantly altered, and over 85% of the area of wetlands has been lost. And this destruction has led to somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million species being threatened with extinction over the coming decades to centuries, although these extinctions are preventable. There are two lines of evidence, both independent. One is extrapolation of the red list of IUCN, and I'm really pleased that Dr. Moore has confidence in IUCN because they have endorsed the analysis we've done in this assessment. Their chief scientist was the main review editor for this extrapolation to 500,000 to 1 million species. They've got a website that says they completely endorse this IPBES report and the extrapolation of the loss of biodiversity is not only an environmental
Just
issue.
one moment, Dr. Watson. Mr. Morano, I'm going to just caution you again to avoid the provocations with your fellow panelist.
It wasn't me.
Whoever directed the witness just now, maybe it wasn't you, Mr. Morano, but let's keep this on a higher level here. Let's direct testimony to the chair and to the committee and show respect for your fellow panelists.
The loss of biodiversity is not only an environmental issue, but as I've said, economic, development, social security, moral and ethical issue. Biodiversity has significant economic value, which should be recognized in national accounting systems, as the World Bank does. It's central to development through food, water and energy security. It's a security issue insofar as loss of natural resources, especially in poor developing countries, can lead to conflict. It's an ethical issue because loss of biodiversity hurts the poorest people who depend on it, and it further exacerbates an already inequitable world. And it's a moral issue, as most religions of the world says we should not destroy nature. The largest driver of biodiversity loss in terrestrial systems in the last several decades has been land use change, primarily the conversion of native habitats into agricultural systems that have been needed to feed the world. The challenge is to transform our agricultural practices, many of which are unsustainable today, into ones that can produce the food we need while simultaneously protecting and conserving biodiversity, and in particular, protecting the quality and quantity of our water resources. This means not expanding into pristine natural habitats, but using sustainable agroecological practices, less chemicals, protecting our soils and our pollinators. Too often, fertilizers, pesticides, and other chemicals run off into our rivers, polluting them, and many of our coastal regions around the world are highly polluted. A related issue is to maintain our remaining wetlands. Most have already been destroyed. These play a critical role in water quality and water quantity. While climate change has not been the dominant driver of loss of biodiversity to date in most parts of the world, it is projected to become an important or more important than the other drivers in the coming decades. Climate change and the loss of biodiversity are issues that affect each other. Climate change adversely affects genetic variability, species richness, populations and ecosystems. In turn, loss of biodiversity affects the climate system. For example, deforestation increases the atmospheric abundance of carbon dioxide, a key greenhouse gas. Therefore, it is essential that the issues of biodiversity loss and climate change are addressed together. This can be accomplished by transforming the way energy is produced and used. However, it is important to recognize that some of the suggested approaches to limit human-induced climate change, such as large-scale afforestation and bioenergy, will adversely affect biodiversity and food and water security if native vegetation is converted into monoculture bioenergy plantations. I see my time is up, so I will stop.
Thank you, Sir Watson. The chair now recognizes Dr. Malcolm for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm excited to be here to speak with you today about this report, which comes at a critical time for wildlife and, of course, for humanity. What the science shows with great rigor is stunning. Like me and many other people, you're probably just starting to come to grips with some of the numbers. Numbers like 1 in 8 species worldwide, up to 1 million species. that are facing extinction in the coming years. That is being driven by the large-scale conversion of terrestrial environments, 75%, and marine environments, 2/3. Populations of native species have declined by over 20% on average, some much higher. Coral reefs, for example, have declined by 50% in area. $500 billion of crops each year are threatened by pollinator loss. Half of the Sustainable Development Goal metrics are in decline. These numbers, these figures, are not good, and they're just examples. We are, as you have heard, losing species faster than ever in human history, tens to hundreds of times faster than the background rate of extinction. We are in the middle of the sixth mass extinction, where the last time this happened, it was because an asteroid hit the planet. Today, we are that asteroid. The top threats to biodiversity are a result of humans living unsustainably, as we've heard this morning, where the greatest threat is past and ongoing land and sea degradation. Natural systems cannot sustain this level of change. The second greatest threat to species is direct exploitation, the hunting, fishing, and other ways we overharvest species. The third greatest threat, one which we are all aware of course, is climate change. In combination with the other threats, the damage we have done and are doing is almost unimaginable. Critically, the consequences for this change are as dire for humanity as they are for wildlife. Ecosystem services, from pollinators to fisheries to water filtration, are all at grave risk because of the damage and losses of natural systems. Yet despite the darkness of these results, there is reason for hope, as this report points out. We also have solutions. And so I'm going to brag about the U.S. for just a moment, because we are fortunate to have a law like the Endangered Species Act, a visionary law passed in 1973 with bipartisan support, still remains popular with the American public today. It is our most powerful tool for preventing extinction, with over 95% of listed species still with us and hundreds of species on the path to recovery. But that bipartisan consensus that has brought us this result of protecting species, protecting the biodiversity that is at threat, has eroded over time. In the last Congress alone, there were over 115 attempts to weaken the ESA. And as we speak here today, the Trump administration is preparing to finalize rules that will weaken how the ESA is implemented, the day-to-day of making conservation work. The act has been weakened over time by the lack of funding. Less than 1/4 of the funding that scientists say is necessary to conserve species has not been provided. Not only that, the limited funding that is allocated is skewed, such that as little as $60 a year is available for some of the other 1,600 species that are listed. With proper funding and political support, the ESA can achieve its full potential in protecting our most imperiled plants and animals and address the threats that we are all talking about here today and are highlighted in the report. Your constituents, even those who choose to not accept the science, depend on nature and the ecosystem services nature provides. While the science is spoken, it is silent on the trade-offs that society will need to make moving ahead. We need decision makers to provide the leadership that is needed to address this challenge, and that's really why I appreciate being here today. You all can make the difference, and just like looking forward back in 1973 when the Endangered Species Act was passed, we can look forward, we can look at the science, and make the difference for wildlife and humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank the witnesses for their testimony. We'll now move to member questions, and the chair recognizes Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes. Before we begin, Mr. Lowenthal, could I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Byer be allowed to join us on the dais? Without objection, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question is for Dr. Watson. Dr. Watson, you've stated that we're eroding the very foundations of our economies, the livelihood, our food security, our health, and the quality of life worldwide. And that much of that is due to both plastic waste, dead zones, overfishing, and acidification, which is that your biggest concern is the state of the oceans, is what I'm hearing, is this. I also represent a coastal community, and I've seen and recognized how the health of our community is dependent upon the health of our oceans and the natural ecosystems around us. Can you touch more on how local economies and populations are intrinsically dependent and tied to the natural world around us, that relationship?
Yes, Dr. Shin could add a couple of words on the fisheries and the coastal areas after I finish, but it's quite clear that we recognize the importance of what I call the market. We grow food, we have fiber, energy, and medicines. They all play out in the market. Unfortunately, there are many other things that have incredible economic value that don't have market value. The control of our climate, the control of pollution, the control of floods, storms, pollination services. So a lot of the economic value of biodiversity is hidden. It's non-market. The World Bank's recognized this for many years, and they've argued that you need to complement, not replace, GDP with 4 forms of capital: built capital, social capital, human capital, and natural capital. And what we argue in our report is that we should start to recognize the incredible economic value, local to national, in all accounting systems. And many countries of the world are indeed starting to do this. So we're not replacing GDP, we're complementing GDP. We do also note, however, one should get rid of many of these environmentally harmful subsidies in agriculture, energy, and transportation that unfortunately are affecting. But maybe Dr. Shin could just add a couple of words on the importance to the local economy of fisheries and coastal areas.
Thank you. Yes, fisheries and the United States of America knows that perfectly. That's why the Magnuson-Stevens Act were put in place and was hugely successful. So that is not only because of safeguarding biodiversity, but also the human livelihoods which depend on fisheries and fisheries income. So basically, there are different components in this regard, and I think the status of the fisheries in U.S. can be a very good example to the rest of the world. And that is also a very good example of a transformative change which has been successful. It's showing to the rest of the world as well that we mustn't panic for a transformative change, but we can panic if we don't do anything. So the result of the Magnuson-Stevens Act in the US waters was that today 45 stocks have been rebuilt. So successful stories such as the Atlantic sea scallop, Pacific whiting, Bering Sea snow crab are famous here, but we have also some other stocks which are still in depletion, such as the Atlantic cod, unfortunately. So different components first, so I talked about that just earlier, so the sustainable fishing and responsible fishing. That goes through combating IUU, and it's not only in national waters, but also in foreign waters, because in the United States, for example, 90% of the seafood comes from abroad, is imported. Also combating harmful subsidies, and on the other part of the chain, there's also responsible consumption. And the recent 2017 poll, the Seafood Watch reported that citizens are ready for that. 70% of the citizens want to have more transparency and traceability of the seafood they consume. And moreover, 55% of them are ready to pay more for having seafood coming from sustainable and responsible and socially respectful seafood coming from abroad and in national waters. So traceability and transparency is hugely important. Equitability to access to resources. Also, one of the tools to address biodiversity and fisheries economic benefits is the instauration of MPS and to expound the MPS, but also to change the status of them, because no-take marine reserves are very rare in the rest of the world. And lastly, waste management, because 35% of the seafood is wasted at the far end of the food chain.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In hearings like this, you try to look for common ground, and I think I heard some from Dr. Shin and Sir Robert here. Getting rid of subsidies, for example, we've been trying to do that for years across the board, and to allow market forces to determine the most efficient use of our resources. Overfishing in international waters is a serious problem. Fortunately, not in American waters. We regulate them, I think, very wisely. In fact, in some cases, we overregulate them. I'm not entirely sure what we can do about Chinese and Russian overfishing in international waters, but it does seem to me that fisheries and aquaponics are a key response to assuring stocks. So if we can agree on those 2 points, that's a lot right there. And maybe, Mr. Chairman, we can put together a bill that will accomplish those goals. However, we also hear solutions like the Paris Treaty and the Green New Deal. And Mr. Morano, could you kind of tell us as a practical matter what that would mean to average American families?
The UN Paris Agreement has been called the most expensive. The UN Paris Agreement has been called the most expensive treaty in world history. And the Green New Deal is estimated to be tens of trillions. There was an estimate of over 90 trillion that people didn't like the numbers, but what it really means is people are going to be sacrificing, especially people on fixed income, to pay higher energy costs for absolutely no benefit. It fails every cost-benefit analysis. In other words, even if you believe, and you shouldn't, but every claim made by the United Nations or Al Gore, the Green New Deal, the UN Paris Agreement will have a temperature difference in 100 years imperceptible. You won't even be able to tell the difference using their own models. So we're paying all this money, raising energy costs, banning energy that's proven to work, mandating energy that's, to put it, say, not yet ready for prime time, in order to solve a crisis, in their words, and it's not going to have any impact. So it fails the basic cost-benefit analysis, and this is what all these solutions, if you go back, again, the 1960s, 70s, all were the same. We need to make energy more expensive, less plentiful. John Holdren has said the same thing. They're trudging out Paul Ehrlich in the media reports now, resurrecting all of his doom and ridiculously debunked claims about all of our Earth. So paying more and turning over to higher regulations isn't going to save people or animals. Actually, less regulation, as you mentioned in your opening statement with Ron Bailey mentioned, when you can actually have infrastructure and you're not dumping sewage waste and you're not clear-cutting forests to survive, species benefit, humanity benefits. In the Amazon, for every acre of forest cut, 50 are regenerating because people are leaving, going to the cities as more and more development come.
Dr. Moore, again, what we're reviewing is not a scientific report. It's a summary for policymakers of a scientific report that has not been made public. Is that science in your understanding of the term?
Well, it's certainly not science to pretend that something isn't happening yet is already happening. That's how I read this. There's a big confusion between historical and present facts versus prediction of apocalypse in the future, which we don't know is going to happen or not, so it's easy to make up scare stories about. I have an essay titled 12 Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, and carbon dioxide and endangered species, in this case, the invisible 6.2 million species, you cannot call yourself a scientist if you pretend that there are 6.2 million species that have no names and have never been identified. That is not science. That is fiction. It is made-up fairy tale stories. And that's what we're being told here. In the same way as I challenge people to please tell me one factor in weather or climate that is anywhere near out of line today with the last 10,000 years of this Holocene interglacial period. Just one. The IPCC clearly states that there is no trend in extreme weather events, and yet that's all we hear from the alarmists, is extreme weather. They used to tell us, oh, no, don't confuse climate with weather. That's not climate, that's just weather because it was cold last winter or whatever. Now, they talk about nothing but extreme weather events, and the fingerprints were on that hurricane, the fingerprints of climate change.
The Paris Treaty and the Green New Deal are all about reducing carbon dioxide. Is that going to make a significant difference on the major drivers that have pushed our climate back and forth through glacial periods and warming periods for 4.5 billion years?
First of all, there is no hard evidence that CO2 has anything to do with the changing temperature of the Earth's climate. Secondly, CO2 is the most important food for all life on Earth. All the carbon in all carbon-based life, which is ourselves and all other life, came from carbon dioxide in the air and the water. Carbon dioxide has been declining steadily for the last 150 million years to its lowest level in the history of life on Earth at the height of the last glaciation, 180 ppm. The reason for this is that life itself has sucked the carbon out of the system and put it into sediments as fossil fuels, but much more importantly, as carbonaceous rocks, a fancy term for limestone, calcium carbonate. That's where all the carbon went. And we, thankfully, are putting some of the CO2 back into
Time's
the
up,
air
Doctor.
that
Thank
was
you.
sucked out by life over the millennia and are restoring a balance to the global carbon cycle.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. This would probably be a good time to request unanimous consent to enter into the record 7 peer-reviewed published studies that show 97% or more of actively publishing scientists agree that climate warming trends over the past century are due to human activities. I'd ask unanimous consent to reflect that overwhelming global scientific consensus through these 7, by way of example, these 7 peer-reviewed studies.
Mr. Chairman, as long as we're on unanimous consents, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record correspondence from Clive Hamler of the Department of Zoology, University of Oxford, indicating his overall assessment is that the summary that we're discussing has too many subjective statements that are not representative of the opinions of many ecologists and conservationists.
Without objection, we will enter that individual scientist's letter along with the peer-reviewed studies that I've just entered into the record. The chair now recognizes the chair of the Natural Resources Committee, Raul Grijalva, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the hearing. It's a very good hearing, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. Let me ask kind of a general question. On this topic, we talk about climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and the exaggerations, and I'm being charitable, around the Green New Deal, climate change itself. We avoid there's not so much climate denial going on in Congress anymore. It's climate avoidance, anything to avoid the topic and to avoid doing something serious about it. And then you get the crocodile tears about any of these, implementing any of the fine recommendations that are forwarded to policymakers from all of you, from the 3 scientists. I think that we need to look at that very, very seriously. And what crocodile tears has to be around the issue of what's going to happen to poor people, low-income people, refugees, those that are more challenged in terms of being able to make adaptations to climate change and loss of biodiversity, and the crocodile tears flow on that. Well, I think this report also, Dr. Bornizio, identifies that there will be disproportionate impacts on indigenous and low-income communities with the predicted changes in climate and biodiversity. It also mentions that many regional and global scenarios lack consideration of this view and these perspectives and the rights of these communities. Could you elaborate on the importance of these communities, the indigenous perspectives, and that provide any recommendations as to how to better integrate those perspectives into the policy decisions that we will have to wrestle with and others? If you wouldn't mind, Doctor.
Eduardo? Thank you for your comment and question. You're right. When we look globally during the past 50 years, we see a displacement of impact, mostly from the global north to the global south. So you have a higher rate of impact that you see in developing and least developed countries, and in many cases affecting the most marginal populations in those areas. We also have to remember that a lot of the urbanization that happened during the past 50 years in the Global South, for instance, happens in conditions that are very precarious. So you have the interactions between all these kinds of environmental change affecting the largest sectors in most developing countries that are living in very difficult conditions. When you look to the next 10 years, most of the expansion in urban areas are projected to take place in sub-Saharan Africa, where similar conditions of precarity are happening. So there, and when you look at the scenarios and models of the interactions between climate change, land use change, and species exploitation, those are the areas that will be most affected, where the population are, in fact, the most affected.
There's a, Doctor, if I may just first, there's a growing reality now of, when we talk about refugees in the full sense of the word, the expression of climate refugees is becoming more and more prominent in the discussion about why people are migrating not just to the United States, but across the globe, and climate now becoming a factor in that migration and people seeking to go elsewhere. Is that a correlation you saw or not?
It's a factor. I think what we understand about human displacement is that it's highly contextual. In many places, different forces contribute to human displacement. Increasingly, in some areas, climate-related issues or environmental change-related issues, being, for instance, lack of water, or competition for water, or long-term droughts, do affect movements of people. But it's important to understand as part of a much broader set of factors affecting that. To go back to your original point about indigenous people and local communities, this is the first assessment that did a comprehensive global analysis and a general mapping of the contributions of indigenous people in particular. And we came to an estimate that at least 25% of the global terrestrial surface are managed or held or traditionally owned by indigenous people and local communities. So they have a significant impact at the global level in managed biodiversity. This corresponds to about 35% of the most intact ecosystems on the planet, and about 35% of all the protected areas. So they are incredibly important partners on those issues. We did a summary of about 470 local indicators of environmental change collected by indigenous people and local communities, and we found that about 72% of those indicators show trends in decline, although decline in those areas are lower than in other areas outside of indigenous lands. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doctor. The chair now recognizes Mr. Webster for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And although I would like to pursue surfing polar bears, I think I'm going to yield my time to Mr. McClintock.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Morano, we just heard we can hear it all the time, to shut down any kind of debate on this subject. Well, 97% of the scientists all agree. What's wrong with you? Would you care to comment on that? Where does that come from?
The 97% is a talking point that's been around. Even in Al Gore's first book, he didn't say 97%, but he said all scientists agree. It's a form of intimidation. It tells people you don't have to understand the science, you don't have to understand the issue. Hey, all you need to know is that United Nations parrots it, the media parrots it, and the few studies out there parrot that 97% of scientists and or studies agree. Well, I have a whole chapter in my book on this. And before Congress, you had a United Nations IPCC lead author testify that the 97%, as evidenced by John Cook, was quite simply, quote, pulled from thin air, unquote. None of the figures in the study justify the 97% claim.
This was the 2013 study by John Cook.
By John Cook, yes, from Australia.
11,944 abstracts, and then somebody else took a look at them.
Yes, there were other studies that they started out with over 10,000 scientists. They whittled it down to 77 scientists. They tortured the data until they came up with 75 or so anonymous scientists who agree with the 97%. We don't know the scientist's name. We don't know their affiliation. We don't know their bios. But that number in those studies are pounded on us daily, over and over, anyone in this debate, to silence dissent.
Dr. Moore?
Anybody who uses the word consensus in relation to science is not a scientist. Consensus is not a scientific word. It is a political word that has to do with majorities in democracies and with policies that are voted on. Consensus in science is meaningless, and that is a fact, because people like Galileo, Mendel, Darwin, Einstein, and many others fought against false consensus or false majority for all their lives in many cases till they died, even though they had the truth. Consensus is not allowed to be used in scientific discussions. It has no meaning whatsoever other than that there is a herd mentality of some kind.
Which is why science has to be independently verifiable. The data has to be out there and has to be verifiable by anyone who is looking at it. And in the case of the Cook report, independent verification found only 0.3% of those 11,944 abstracts and 1.6% of the smaller sample that excluded those papers, expressing no opinion, endorsed man-made global warming as they defined it. So
yes,
it's not a 97% consensus, it's a 0.3% consensus.
There is a difference between a consensus or a majority of people agreeing on a certain thing.
Which gets me back to the principal question that brings us all here today. Where's the scientific report? We don't have one. We have a summary written by politicians, but we don't have the actual report, so we can't begin to independently verify it. Is that science?
You are correct. The key distinction that has to be made here is the difference between a fact and a policy. It is facts that inform policy. Policy is an opinion. It is a decision that is made based, hopefully, on good facts. The policies that are being recommended by the alarmists on the climate side are not based on good facts. And therefore, no matter what percentage of scientists agree with them, it's not going to give you good policy.
Now, Dr. Moore, you mentioned that over the broad 4.5 billion years of the planet, there have been periods where carbon dioxide concentrations have been much, much higher than they are today. They're about 400 parts per million today. During the Cambrian period, they were at roughly 8,000 parts per million. So many, many times higher. And you testified that scientists conclude that the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have been declining over those millennia to the point where we reached in the modern era the lowest concentration we recorded. You said it got down to as low as 180 parts per million. What happens at 150 parts per million?
At 150 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, plants die. They don't just need carbon dioxide to survive, they need a certain level of it, just like we need a certain level of oxygen to survive.
And what do growers use as an enriched atmosphere for plant growth in their greenhouses?
Virtually all commercial greenhouse growers enrich the atmosphere in their greenhouse with between 800 and 1,200, in other words, 2 to 3 times the level in the global atmosphere today, in order to get 20 to 60% increase in growth. And indeed, this is happening globally as we have increased CO2 from 280 to 410 parts per million. A greening of the earth is occurring. NASA has it on their website. The Australian scientists and the European scientists all confirm that there has been a massive increase in global biomass, that is plant biomass, as a result of the CO2 fertilization of the earth, otherwise known as the greening of the earth. We, in fact, by releasing the CO2 back into the environment from where it was depleted by life in the first place, are the salvation of life on Earth, because it has gone down as low as 180.
Doctor, I have allowed extra time a couple of times now, but I have to bring it back to the committee, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Byer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, very much, and thanks for letting me attend this hearing. And I'm really clear, because having read the report and listened to a number of people explain it in the last couple of weeks, it becomes incredibly clear that we're destroying the core of our livelihood, food, health, economy if we don't act now. So as the chairman knows really well, the whole notion of the islands of different endangered species that are not able to interbreed and interact, and not just wildlife, but flora also. So just this last week, we introduced the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, bipartisan with Representative Buchanan from Florida and Senator Udall from New Mexico, to ensure that wildlife, fish, animals, plants can continue to migrate, adapt, and thrive in the face of increasing threats to their population. So this is a major step forward, and I'm thrilled that this committee will be considering the legislation. Dr. Malcolm, the Endangered Species Act was the third most attacked piece of legislation in the last Congress. I think the Affordable Care Act was probably ahead of it. Most of the time, my Republican friends take issue with the fact that the ESA doesn't take into economic considerations into the listing of the species. For example, the effect on the average American family. But the report outlines that there are potential tremendous economic risks when we lose species. Can you comment on the economic payoff of protecting species versus the burden of complying with ESA regulations?
I can speak to the fact that we have now 40 some odd years showing that the Endangered Species Act worked incredibly well, and as we all know, the American economy has continued to grow throughout that entire time. There is not a conflict between protecting species and improving human well-being. That the report highlights this. The effectiveness of the ESA. We also heard about Mangus and Stevens. There are other laws like the Lacey Act. All of these point to how we can have laws that protect species while not interfering with economic growth. That there are, in fact, these synergies between protecting the resources and economic growth. There are issues of international trade where we have agreements like CITES that helps ensure species don't go extinct, and at the same time, there is not anything other than a synergistic relationship with economies. In the U.S., we also have lots of public lands that contribute to protecting species, whether they're national forest or they're Department of Defense installations. These public lands are contributing ultimately to our economy while also protecting species. And we have a corridors bill up right now that is going to help protect additional species, help protect habitats, and it's, I'm sure, going to show the same relationship that the report finds that we have seen throughout the history of protecting and conserving species, that this is a win-win situation, that there are benefits all around. We have the history to show us this. We understand the science of why this is the case.
Great. Thank you very much. Dr. Brindizio, some members of this committee have argued that because a particular species is recovered, for example, right whales, although it's still endangered, that we don't need to worry about other species. Dr. E.O. Wilson, I believe, was the first who really articulated the whole idea of biodiversity. Can you drill down on why biodiversity is important for humanity and for the planet?
Beyond, when you talk about biodiversity, we tend to go to the charismatic species, right, that tend to touch us, and we forgot the larger role of biodiversity in ecosystem functioning. So when we see that we have clean water, we have quantity of water available to society, that agriculture can succeed because of pollination, right, the health ecosystem, that tourism and local economies can succeed because of healthy landscapes and ecosystems. Those are all aspects in which biodiversity makes a difference to us. So when we talk about the general impact on biodiversity, we're talking about the transformation of larger ecosystems as well, and not look at species separate from the larger role that they play in nature, and therefore how we benefit from those roles for nature.
Mr. Chair, I yield back, I believe.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Bishop for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity of being one of the few people in this subcommittee who's here, and I appreciate the witnesses for your time and effort in traveling the distance to be here as well. This is about, we're almost to the dozen climate change hearing mark for this committee. Some of them actually have been about issues within our jurisdiction, which is cool. But this is supposed to be responding to the Global Assessment Report, a report that is not released, it's not available. We are actually responding to a global assessment press release and executive summary. In essence, the purpose of this hearing should be for those people who sit on that table over there in the corner who aren't here either. I guess there's one person over there after all. There are those who say that we are in science denial. Not necessarily so. But if you look at science that has been used by the Department of Interior, there is such a thing as scientific integrity. And there have been complaints about scientific integrity or lack of so. You'll notice on the chart that's up there, in 2015 was actually the high point in complaints of scientific integrity. 16 different complaints were brought about it. Last year, there were only 2. So sometimes we have to look at what we are doing, what the reality is, where we are going, what the entire purpose is. I'm sorry, right now, I feel like I'm part of a book club, and we're going to give opinions on the book, except we're all making it up because no one has actually read the book. If you'd actually waited until the report was released and people could look at it, maybe there would be a point at that point that this could be a legitimate hearing. Maybe that's why only 30% of the minority that's on this committee have shown up. You beat us, though. We only have 20% of our people here on this committee. But it says something about the concept that we are dealing with in these committees. I would urge the majority party to deal with things that are in the jurisdiction of our committee where we can make a difference. If we could talk about stewardship issues, which we have in the past, if we could talk about safeguarding federal forests, we could talk about carbon sequestration and how that can improve air quality and mitigate against catastrophic wildfires. If we could talk about federal permitting that develop new energy products, or even if we developed clean energy proposals but talked about how you have to have corridors to get the energy from where it is produced to where the people live, and we have problems with actually energy corridors. Those are things that are in the jurisdiction of the committee that is something positive that we could actually deal with at this particular point. Right now, I just feel frustrated that we are doing this far too soon without proper preparation, and I would like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. McClintock as well.
Well, thank you. Getting to the question of diversity, Dr. Moore, we heard we're entering a 6th extinction, and I think you did a very good job of debunking that prediction. But there have been 5 other extinctions that we have, that paleontology has documented. How did those events affect species diversity?
Well, the 5 great extinctions, the most severe one being the Permian, we only really more or less know the cause of the last one 65 million years ago, when about 20% of all the families of taxonomic life were exterminated by an asteroid impact in northern Yucatan, which penetrated the Earth's crust and caused vast amounts of interior lava to go into the stratosphere and blacken the skies for enough years to basically end photosynthesis, so the food supply was cut off. It's thought that the other extinctions were similar, but could have been caused by massive volcanic eruption earlier in the Earth's life, when it was hotter inside. Today, that would be very unlikely because the Earth has cooled considerably. So we don't need to worry as much about volcanic activity in the future as we do about another asteroid extinction. But again, they maybe happen once every 65 million years. This so-called 6th great extinction is a complete fabrication. There was a pulse of extinctions from 1500 on as Europeans colonized islands in particular in the Pacific, including big ones like Australia, where many species went extinct due to the introduction of exotic predators like cats and rats and foxes and snakes.
And about 85% of the extinctions we've seen are because of invasive
Yes,
species.
today it's introduced species, especially on islands where there's a small area and a rat can get on an island and eat all the birds' eggs, and that's the end of the birds. That is the classical situation that has occurred lately. But I would just like
to... We have to raise taxes and increase the price of energy in order to stop that for some
Yes, but
reason.
looking for common ground, I'd like to
leave that
endorse,
as the final
I'd like to
word
endorse
since
a lot
time
of
has
what
expired.
Dr. Malcolm said.
Doctor, you're going to owe me a lot of time at the end of this hearing because we keep drifting past the red light there. The chair now recognizes myself for the next 5 minutes. You know, we tried hard to set up this hearing as a serious conversation with some of the world's leading scientists about a deeply troubling international report warning us, not for the first time, that we were entering into an extinction crisis and that it was being driven primarily by human activities. I felt like, given our jurisdiction, which actually begins with water, oceans, and wildlife in the title of this subcommittee, that's a pretty square fit with what this subcommittee exists to consider. So it seemed like an important subject for us to explore together with some really esteemed scientists. We're very grateful and honored by your presence. I have to say I'm disappointed that our friends across the aisle seem to have taken a different tack with the witnesses they have called and the tenor of the conversation. Mr. Morano, I have a political science degree too, and I know the limitations of that degree. I don't know what inspires someone to make a career out of trolling scientists or monetizing contrarian ideology on the YouTube and TED Talk circuit, but it's just a very different kind of conversation than the science-based conversation I think many of us would like to try to have. So in the remaining time that I have, which is not nearly enough, Sir Watson, I want to come back to you because you've heard a lot of this stuff before. I mean, from the shadowy corners of these junior varsity think tanks that appear in these settings, you hear claims that high levels of CO2 concentration are actually good for biodiversity, that there is no extinction problem, that extinction is actually slowing. We've heard some of this stuff drudged out again today. This is your chance to respond to that, and I'll give the similar opportunity to the other scientists.
Thank you. Both the IPCC and IPBES have shown unequivocally that increasing greenhouse gas concentrations changes the Earth's atmosphere. There's no question that more CO2 can green the biosphere. No question at all, we say that. But in a greenhouse, you also make sure there's enough nutrients and water, and that's why in a greenhouse it makes sense to increase the atmospheric CO2. In the real world, however, many parts of the world are drying, and there is strong evidence that we are seeing increases in extreme weather events, more heat waves, more droughts, and more floods. And there's no question it's promoted by greenhouse gas emissions. Now, what do we need to do? We're saying in our report we can save biodiversity and it can be made economic. We need to integrate biodiversity concerns into all our sectoral policies: agriculture, forestry, energy, transportation. There's no dichotomy between a strong economy and conserving and sustainably using biodiversity. We've got to recognise, however, we do need to eliminate harmful subsidies in agriculture and actually have incentives for sustainable agriculture, eco-agriculture. It can be done very easily. We've also got to, as I said earlier, complement GDP, not eliminate GDP as an economic measure, but to recognise the importance of natural capital, as many of the banks around the world are doing.
Dr. Watson, could you be sure to speak to the actual science underpinning the report, because it's been suggested that there's no science.
Okay, that we analysed 15,000 peer-reviewed publications and other pieces of information. It went extensively through peer review. We received 15,000 comments from experts from
peer review a scientific process to measure consensus?
Basically, what we wanted to do was to find out what do we know and what don't we know, where is there unanimous agreement about what's happening, where are there differences of opinion, what's known, what's uncertain. It's the most heavily peer-reviewed document ever.
Thank you. Dr. Shen, I know you're trying to get in on this as well. Let me give you a chance.
If I might add something about CO2, also I should mention that CO2 has a great effect on ocean acidification. So it impacts coral reefs, of course, but also things that we don't see. So Mr. Morano was talking about the polar bear. I was more concerned about the euphausids and the krill in the Antarctic Ocean, which is impacted by ocean acidification. That's at the basis of the whole food chain in the Antarctic Ocean.
All right, and Dr. Brindizio?
I want to clarify the issue of
Clarify the issue of mass extinction. The report never used the term sixth mass extinction. We don't use the term mass extinction because it has a particular technical definition. And what we show does not suggest that we are in a sixth mass extinction as referred to the previous 5. So that's a sort of a misinterpretation, I guess. It means, though, that we are on the same page on the scale of the impact of threatening species. So we're perhaps disagreeing on categories, but not on the scale of the problem. But it's important to clarify that the report never made that particular.
What is the proper characterization of the conclusion? Is it that these species you've identified are at risk of extinction? Yes. Would that be a better characterization?
That's how we present. We present risk of extinction. Right. So, which means that during this century, the convergence of the different drivers, for the physical drivers and climate change, will reduce enough their habitats and the viability of that population to potentially lead to extinction.
Thank you, Doctor.
And that's based on very solid evidence.
Thank you very much. The Chair now recognizes Ms. Radewagen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member. I have no questions, but I would like to yield my time to Mr. McClintock.
Thank you very much. Dr. Moore, we're told this is a great report. It's been peer-reviewed. We got lots of comments back on it. Why wouldn't they release it?
Well, if it's been peer-reviewed, then somebody has corroborated the fact, the supposed fact, that there are 6.2 million species that we don't know exist. So I'm not quite clear how any scientist would peer-review something that says that. That's the center of the whole thing. 1 million species could nowhere near be endangered if we recognize that there are
We've actually cataloged about 1.8.
Yes, 1.8 million is it's slightly less than that. It's rounded off, but
so the rest we're simply assuming exist.
Fictitious, yes.
Is that science to your mind?
No, categorically not.
Maybe that's.
And anybody who peer-reviewed a paper that claimed there were 6.2 million unnamed species is not a scientist.
Well, I think they should probably release that report then, because if they have suddenly discovered 6 million new species and cataloged them, assigned them classifications, that's probably one of the greatest breakthroughs in the history of science, and we ought to get that information right away, don't you think?
Well, I for one would like to know, for example, with the drastic decline in marine biodiversity, which is in capital letters on a heading in this Dr. Shin's report, I would like to know, other than the Atlantic right whale, I'm pretty good on marine biology, other than the Atlantic right whale, give me 5 marine species that have gone extinct in the last 50 years.
We've actually done several hearings on the right whale, and what we discovered is we hunted them to near extinction, and now the gene pool in the North Atlantic population is so small, they're having a very difficult time coming back, but their populations are thriving in other parts
Almost
of the ocean.
all other whale species are recovering well after we went out in the 1970s.
As is the right whale in the southern Atlantic and Pacific.
Correct. I don't know of a list of marine species that have gone extinct lately, and I think biodiversity means the number of species. It's different than biomass, and it's true that overfishing has caused a reduction in some populations' biomass in the ocean, but I'd like someone to give me the names of a list of the species that have gone extinct in the oceans. I don't know of any.
Dr. Moore, Hermann Hart of Helmut-Schmidt University in Hamburg, Germany, wrote an April 2019 article where he suggests that CO2 doesn't regulate global warming, but in fact global temperatures themselves dominantly control CO2 levels. In fact, by unanimous consent, I'd like to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
And I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Yes, well, especially during this Pleistocene ice age, which was, they agree, was set on about 2.6 million years ago. For the first 1.5 million years, the glaciations were on a 40,000-year cycle in line with the tilt of the Earth. For the last 1 million years, they've been on a 100,000-year cycle in line with the changes in the shape of the Earth's rotation from more elliptical to less elliptical around the sun. And during those periods, as the oceans cooled going into glaciations, large amounts of CO2 were sucked out of the air, ingassing or absorption of the CO2, because cold water holds more gas than warm water does. It's like when you take a glass of water out of the fridge and put it on your counter, little bubbles form in it as it warms up. That's the gas coming out. When the oceans warm, like they did coming into the modern age now, you had CO2 coming back out of the oceans. The oceans have 40 times as much CO2 in them as the atmosphere does, so a 1% change in oceanic CO2 makes a big change in atmospheric CO2. There is no doubt in the Vostok Ice Core records and other ice core records that it is the warming of the oceans and the cooling of the oceans that is causing the changes in CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, since we started using fossil fuels, we are the dominant influence of CO2 in the atmosphere, causing it to rise back to levels that are more conducive for the survival of life on Earth than they had become during the peaks of the last 4, 5, 6 glaciations, when they sunk to within 30 parts per million of the death of plants.
I need to pause right there because I want to get one more question in, and that is, you're one of the original founders of Greenpeace. The health of our oceans has been a lifetime passion for you. Could you give us a quick recap of the state of our coral reefs?
Well, one of the great bright lights is the advent of aquaculture, which is now producing over 50% of the seafood that we are eating every day around the world. And this promises to take pressure off the wild stocks. We do need more regulation in international waters on fisheries because there's no regulation out there in many cases. But
Thank you, Dr.
the world's
Moore.
fisheries are not endangered with extinction.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. This would be a good time to request unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from Greenpeace on its website debunking Dr. Moore's claims of founding and representing Greenpeace. Included in this is Dr. Moore's application to Greenpeace dated 1 year after Greenpeace was started. Without objection, that will be entered into the record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Costa for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing. Part of the frustration that I think I and my colleagues share is that 5 minutes is certainly not enough time to discuss such an important topic. And what I want to do is kind of get your comments as it relates to our attempts here through the Endangered Species Act to deal with the challenges that are presented with climate change, sea levels rising, and other factors as we try to deal with a ever-changing set of circumstances. You know, 200 years ago, it was estimated we had 1.7 billion people on the planet. A couple years ago, we clicked 7 billion. It's estimated by the middle of this century, I guess I won't be here, but we're going to have 9 billion people on the planet. There's no question that the climate has always been changing, but we are obviously adding to that change in many ways, not to the positive direction that we want to see. So we look at tools to deal with changes in trying to moderate CO2 levels. I've been down to the South Pole. I've seen studies that have been done there. I'm very concerned, I think as everybody is, about what we can and can't do. Clearly, what is the ethos in terms of trying to make that difficult choice from a public policy standpoint? Because species have been going extinct naturally, you know, but now obviously mankind is accelerating that impact of species extinction, whatever the number may be. Does it make sense to any of you that we ought to try to look on value added as to what is possible and what's not possible in terms of trying to curb this change on a host of things that we can do something about?
I would just add real quick that in the Amazon rainforest, studies show that with the new logging techniques, within 7 years, the mix of plant and animal species are indistinguishable from forests that have been cut. New technologies, new ways of doing it. There's also a whole animal arc movement that's private breeders are saving endangered species, at least privately. You don't have to go to the pet store and get animals that were taken from the wild, but they were bred privately, so we're not harming nature. There's all kinds of things that you can do that are making an impact and hopeful on species threats.
Yes.
There's no question we can do a lot of things that make economic sense and environmental sense. There is no question we can use our energy much more sustainably. That will help everybody.
But some species undoubtedly will go extinct regardless.
Some species will go extinct, especially these critically endangered species. But the very large percentage of the species that we say are vulnerable and are at threat, if we start to manage our land much better, much more ecological agriculture.
Well, let me give a question there, because that's something I have a little background in. We have real challenges of water management in the West, and specifically in California. And undoubtedly, as a result of a combination of factors involving climate change, less snowpack, greater rainfalls, difficulty capturing that water, it's probably going to result in some land going out of production. There's consequences to that, not only putting food on America's dinner table and elsewhere because of food security, but also fallow land creates a host of other environmental issues.
Yes, I mean, managing our agriculture sustainably would allow us to also make sure we've got good water quantity and good water.
The largest water district in the United States, I believe, is 95% drip irrigated.
Sorry, I missed what you said, sir.
The largest irrigated water district in the United States is 95% drip irrigated.
Yeah. And what we know is that we can the US does a much better job than most countries in the world of using drip agriculture, and it's actually crucial.
Well, we've combined resources with Israel and Netafim and other high technologies because of the valuable nature of water. And by the way, Westland's irrigation district is that district, but many other water districts are using state-of-the-art irrigation technologies.
And I think you're saying exactly what this report says. There are good solutions to managing our water, managing our agriculture.
But there's trade-offs, because if you just irrigate the root zone, you're not recharging the groundwater either.
Yeah. Eduardo, do you want to add anything on the water resource issue?
Yeah, I mean, that's one topic that we cover in detail. It's one of those topics where we see a lot of sectoral initiatives that are very important at the local level, but that ultimately you need cross-sectoral management that combines both landscape level planning and integration with other types of land use, and local level planning for managing extraction and other issues.
May I ask a question through the chair? I missed a definition here. What's cross-sectorial definition mean?
You're asking me to?
Well, he mentioned it twice, and it's a definition that
maybe we had better ask.
Maybe it was defined before I came here, and I missed it.
Cross-sector? Does someone want to?
Cross-sector. So that means that, you look at the agricultural sector, with water management, the forest sector, with weather management.
What it sounds like. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Not sure.
Very good. The chair now recognizes Mr. Gosar for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Sir Robert Watson, I'm so glad you said magic to my ears about we can manage our landscapes much better. I mean, and the number one aspect here in the United States is our mismanagement of our forests. I mean, when you talk about water penetration and water surface area, down in the Southwest, Ponderosa Forest, we're typically 40 to 60 trees per acre, not 1,000 trees per acre. And the catastrophic fires have been inbred in that. It's not so much the climate change, it's just what we've done with those magnified landscapes. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Mr. Chairman, well, first of all, Dr. Moore, I have in front of me a photograph of Greenpeace. It says here, and the topic is Founders of Greenpeace. Are you listed on here?
Yes, sir, I am.
So it's kind of interesting that we tried to change history by what we saw entered into the record. So I would like to enter into the record, this for the record, to show that it is a photo of Greenpeace that actually shows that...
Was that Photoshop, a Freudian slip?
No, it's not. It's Freudian. It's a screenshot of Greenpeace that shows that the good doctor is one of the...
Greenpeace actually took his name off their list of founders. They had previously published his name consistently as one of the founders.
We will enter that into the record along with his job application 1 year after the founding of Greenpeace, which will provide
Mr. Chairman, I wasn't aware that you were present at that circumstance. That's an incorrect characterization.
Mr. Gosar, the time is yours.
Well, coming back to you, Dr. Moore, I certainly appreciate people starting to talk about, the anatomy of our planetary system. And now we're becoming, from NASA, we're understanding now that there's a cycle with the sun. Is that true?
Well, yes, I've always said that it's galling to me, all these people that pretend to be able to predict the future when I have to admit that I can't because it seems like they're smarter than I am.
Well, and geological time
so
teaches that.
Yes, I've been watching this prediction of the grand solar minimum for some time now, and now it is coming to pass. And so I'm willing to say that, yes, it appears as though the grand solar minimum is occurring and will continue to occur for some time and will result in a cooling of the climate, which we see just in the last couple of years beginning to set in. Indeed, in the Arctic, the ice is more prevalent now than it has been for many years, at least 14. And so the trend is going in the opposite direction to the prediction of ever-increasing warmth and loss of ice. So we do see, it's long been stated that the sun is the main controller of the Earth's climate.
I appreciate that, but also, you know, the composition of our Earth. We have a magma core, we have plate tectonics, so there's a whole number of things. Another question for you, Dr. Moore. If a success rate of 3%, is that a good number?
For the predictions of the climate models?
No. A success rate of 3%, is that a good number if you're talking about?
No, sir.
How about you, Dr. Morano, Mr. Morano? Is 3% a good number? So, for example, if I was a doctor and I admitted 100 patients and only 3 of them survived, I know it's great for the 3 that survived, but is that a great number for what we call success story?
No, it's not. The interesting thing about the biodiversity issue here, and one thing we're talking about is life thrives in warmth. So around the equator, plant and animal species thrive. As you get further and further away from the equator, you get less and less animal species. And that's one of the things, people fear warmth when it comes to life. It hasn't panned out and is not panning out. Now, all kinds of threats could be there in the future, but turning over to central planning to the United Nations is not one of the solutions.
Well, I mean, I heard in regards to endangered species that it's just about money, but it's not. It's absolutely not. I mean, we've got court rulings that actually saw such an abysmal lifting of the Southwest gray wolf that they actually remanded it back to the states. That's how bad it was. It's not just about money. It's about protocols and science. You put out a hypothesis, you actually do a body of it, and you come with a conclusion, and then you have it verified independently. Is that true, Mr.?
Yes, in fact, in my written testimony, I submitted a report by Rob Gordon, who studied endangered species for years and goes in detail of the flaws of the Endangered Species Act as it's currently being practiced. Much of it, and particularly out west, has been shoot, shovel, and shut up. It's got perverse incentives that actually end up harming animals because there's no incentive to ever report that you found one because
real quick question.
Private property rights.
The last die-off, Dr. Moore, was man present for the last die-off?
No, that was 65 million years ago.
That's what I thought. So yield back.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the close of the hearing. I do want to thank all of the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their thoughtful questions. Members of the committee might have some additional questions for our witnesses. We would ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following this hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, this committee stands adjourned. Thank you.
Good hearing.
Your stuff for this. You want to leave me with your stuff for this?
Yeah. Oh, my God.